So thank you everyone for coming, especially seeing as we are so many continents apart, and because given all the time zones and everything, scheduling this was a little difficult. But thank you all for being here. I'd just like to start by saying that this piece of research has been a long time coming, and it's not just the 6 years I've spent in doing this PhD, but all my experiences before that in India, working as a consultant, working on action research projects, specifically shout out to Aapki Sadak, which was a public realm project, and my teaching experience in Delhi, which sort of all led up to this research and is in many ways informed my approach towards this study. So just to begin, the title of my dissertation is The Story of My House, because it really is an exploration of my own experiences with house building and my parents' experiences with house building. And so a core part of this PhD is autoethnographic. And just to situate everyone, this study is in Delhi, which is a part of what is called the National Capital Region in India, which are sort of several districts around Delhi, which also form a part of the National Capital Region. Now, Delhi is a very complex and an extremely populous city. Much has been written about Delhi. And so when it came time for me to research my own kind of urban setting, my own childhood, my own experiences, it was really a matter of scope, of defining the right scope for the study. And the whole thing begins with the study of what are called builder floors. And so the main focus of this research is builder floors. It will become clear that builder floors are a lot less defined and a lot more amorphous as this presentation will go along. But builder floors are basically 4 to 5 story residential buildings that are raised on stilts for parking on the ground floor. But they're also a kind of contractual arrangement between somebody called a builder and a homeowner, where the builder purchases land or collaborates with or buys out an undivided share of the property of the said property in exchange for investing his time, resources, labor, capital in building up this property. And in exchange, they typically receive one of the floors. So what are they really? Imagine that you have just migrated to a newly independent nation's capital, and you're looking for housing. Now, at that time, Delhi didn't really have many options, so you kind of live in the older parts of the city, renting out mostly. And then these neighborhoods, newly planned neighborhoods, start being available for purchase. So you go out and you buy a plot of land for yourself and you build yourself a house. This is the story for many people in Delhi. What we call planned colonies were the major form of residential expansion after independence. And so what you see in the photograph on the left are these single-story tiny houses. Sorry, I'll just go back. Behind the foliage, the one in yellow, the one you can see, these are the kinds of houses that people started building. But over the years, people started also growing those houses. People added floors, people made incremental changes to the point where now redevelopment of these properties could also look like what is on the right-hand side, which are these 5 story monstrosities where the ground floor is dedicated towards parking. So what I am basically studying is this phenomenon, the phenomenon of the transition that single family homes have made into builder floors and all the attendant sort of fallouts and impacts that they kind of create. This is my chapter structure within the dissertation. I just want to point out here that a core part of this dissertation, again, is chapter 2, which is the story of my house, which is what will mostly form the content for today's presentation. There is a lot more detail in the other chapters that will just be sort of referenced a little bit through this presentation. But if anyone wants to read the whole dissertation, I can also forward that. So the chapter 1 talks about narrative structure of the dissertation, how I'm approaching it, my research questions, the methodology I take. The second chapter, as I said, is the story of my house. Chapters 3 to 6 are the various aspects of the builder floors and how they kind of relate to the larger urban processes in Delhi. And so they are, in some ways, my empirical chapters. And chapter 7 is where I make some speculations about housing futures. So to begin, I just want to clarify why I'm studying builder floors. I mean, other than the matter of scope. So it wasn't just that this is a very sort of clean, neat and clean typology to study, a specific kind of phenomenon that is happening and that sort of focuses my sort of PhD research, but it's also quite significant within the urban milieu. So for most middle class plotted colonies, this is a phenomenon that has been overrun and has been very prolific. Most people you talk to in Delhi would know what builder floors are. They have encountered them, they have gone through this transition themselves, or they at least know of others around them that have done this. They have drastically changed the relationship that houses have to the street. The sociality of the neighborhood at large has transformed because of them. They have restructured social and spatial relationships within the household. So privacy of spaces, security, the idea of comfort and luxury kind of all have transformed with builder floors. They have also changed people's relationships with the land, their property as an asset, and their conception of home as asset or as capital, as speculative capital. Builders have also changed the professional landscape of residential construction and in the city at large because of their operational model and their organizational structure and their sort of word of mouth processes and business development. The builder floors, might have also exacerbated a major ongoing parking crisis in Delhi's neighborhoods. Just a caveat here to say that I will use the terms middle class and plotted colonies a lot throughout this presentation. And these are sort of contingent provisional terms. The middle class, statistically speaking, in India is certainly not the landed class of property owners in the capital city of Delhi. These are effectively elite, the urban elite, and are certainly not what might be called middle class. But people continue to identify themselves as middle class, and that's a huge part of what I'm studying through the chapters here. Plotted colonies, the word colony requires a little bit of a definition, but essentially through the British rule, colonial settlements, colonial planned settlements that were kind of dotted around indigenous formations, indigenous settlements at the time were called colonies, and that kind of term stuck. And so now most people in Delhi, at least, would refer to neighborhoods around them as colonies, and it's just common parlance. So this study then is about many things. It's about social and class relations. It's about architectural type. It's about urban planning and mobility. It's about neoliberal development and real estate market pressures on the development of these neighborhoods. But most importantly, across these aspects, it's about transformation and becoming. Transformation of the land, transformation of the idea of capital, transformation in the idea of or the conception of the home, of private dwellings, transformation in the idea of intergenerational legacies, and the role that homeowners play in the city. So that is what this research is primarily about. And in studying those transformations, I'm picking up four major strands or four major sort of urban processes that the builder floor becomes a part of. This is not to say that the builder floor is sort of some sort of a culmination of these processes. So there is no clear causal chains which lead up to this final point, which is builder floors. In many ways, we always start in the middle. And so the builder floors happen to have these connections across the intergenerational communal migration of people as they've looked for a home and made home. The circulation of speculative capital around the city, especially in residential construction, the idea of the home, and automobility and the parking crisis. So these processes are related. And my argument here is that the progression in one reinforces or impacts progression in another. So this really ends up becoming about legibility. My research questions are therefore about how urban processes are made legible through the study of builder floors. By looking at builder floors carefully, what can we know about other things that are already happening and continue to happen? What is being perpetuated? What is being transformed? So each of the sub-questions relate to each of the chapters. As I said, one to do with the migration and the settlement of middle-class families and communities across Delhi's geography, the relationship to residential property and land ownership models, the relationship of the prominence of builders and speculative capital, the lifestyles and aspirations of the middle-class families, specifically in regards to private dwelling, and automobile dependency in the city, which is specifically linked to parking. I collected a fair amount of data across different methods, and so this is a fairly mixed method study. I looked at a lot of court cases because as one of the court cases I will talk about is sort of central to the idea of builder floors. And many acts and laws that dictate the sale and exchange of property, that are supposed to regulate the real estate market, that are laws about the formation of cooperative housing societies, etc. I also looked at the municipal database, which is an online resource of all the building permits, which in India are called building sanctions, going back to 2013. That provided me with some idea of how many people have sort of applied for redevelopment of their single-family homes. I also conducted a broad interest online survey circulated through this agency that I have worked with in the past called United Residents Joint Action. It's an association, it's a conglomeration of about 1,500 resident welfare associations across Delhi. So they have a broad reach across the middle class, particularly the property owning class. And they helped me kind of circulate this over WhatsApp and other media. And I got quite a few, about 150 responses, from which I gleaned a fair bit of data about housing choice. And mainly it was about understanding why people choose to live in a plot, in a sort of single family home, versus in a group housing or an apartment or a flat in a housing complex. Because these are the two main forms of kind of housing in the city. And I got quite a bit of data. For example, the word cloud at the bottom right-hand corner shows how people responded to the question of why they chose group housing over plotted colonies. And parking is, of course, a big one where most people were saying, hey, you have dedicated parking spaces in group housing where you don't get that in these plotted colonies. But the core of my research was talking to a lot of people at length. So I conducted a fair bit of semi-structured interviews with three categories of participants: homeowners, builders, and experts. And throughout this presentation, you will see names from interview excerpts, but those are all anonymized. So those names are pseudonyms, uh, names that I've swapped out for homeowners and builders who wish to remain anonymous. Experts, on the other hand, were mainly speaking from their position of expertise, and so didn't really have a problem being kind of identified. So here's how the story goes. The story goes, after independence, a lot of these plotted colonies with single family homes were proliferated, were planned. And over the course of a couple of decades, they got inhabited. People started living in them. People started growing their house. With economic liberalization and with the real estate boom through the 80s and the 90s, people started building up. People started expanding their houses. This also led to sort of increased vehicular ownership. This led to growth in personal wealth and the civic power of the middle class. It also attracted sort of and created a niche for these professionals called builders, and a greater circulation of speculative capital through the residential market, eventually leading also to a parking crisis. And all of this has led to the construction boom in builder floors across the city. But this narrative is a fairly simplistic kind of chain of events, which obviously has lots of partial truths. People's experiences have been different. People's journeys have been different. And so much of my research is about further complicating what seems like a fairly simple narrative. Now, as I said, right after independence, there was a huge influx of refugee population in Delhi. This has been documented well across lots of studies. Most importantly, this led to a lot of refugee housing in terms of led by the Ministry of Rehabilitation at the time. Lots of refugee camps, both permanent and temporary, were established. And much of that was built, was planned, were developed slightly further away from the center. So the map in the middle is the areas which were inhabited before independence and already had a sort of thriving residential neighborhoods. But the map on the right show the refugee camps that were kind of spread out around the peripheries of what was the sort of established city at the time. Another category of migrants to the city at the time were a lot of government employees. So, given that it's a newly independent nation, a lot of government offices, central government offices, were just starting out, and they needed lots of employees. And so, a lot of people moved to the city to be uh, to be officers, government servants, as they're called. And both of these forms of housing, the refugee housing, which was in the form of tenements, and the government quarters, as they're called, were fairly frugal kind of dwelling units. As one study describes, tenements were single room sizes of 14 feet by 10 feet and a small veranda in front, sometimes with a front and a backyard, sometimes without a backyard. And so this is the form of housing that a lot of people were first introduced to when they were migrants to the city. When I say people, I mean mainly middle class who were already had a stable income either through government job or through entrepreneurship. But in addition to that, sorry, she's unable to. Right. Okay, moving on. There were also other existing dwelling units or existing forms of typologies of dwellings in the city, obviously. But given that Shahjahanabad and New Delhi, which is the sort of colonial capital city, were the two main kind of urban sort of centers at the time, they were typically in the form of havelis in the old city, which are these mansion type inward looking courtyard houses. multi-storied structures, typically with joint families living in them, exclusive mostly for noblemen and merchants and big families, while bungalows were designed for colonial officers and other kind of nationalist elite who were sort of invited to have these bungalows and kothis, which is another type. But the point is that these pre-existing housing types had a lot to do with the aspirations that the middle class had for their new home. People who were living in rented accommodation, eventually getting a choice to build their own home, carried with them these memories of living in a joint family or having the aspirations to have a big front yard and a kind of expansive, luxurious private home. This is one of the examples. On the map to the right shows the various cases that I've analyzed in my dissertation of intergenerational migration or communal migration across Delhi and how they moved either letting go of ancestral property or establishing a new foothold in a city where they have none. In this case, a lot of the property, a lot of the plots that were on sale were available through these things called auctions by the Delhi Development Authority. This is what the Mrs. Ghosh is mentioning here. And as she says, this was sort of corroborated by a lot of other past participants. There was a kind of growing frustration with the tenuous and the precarity of living in the older parts of the city in rented accommodation. And so a lot of people decided to kind of invest in a plot. Now, these neighborhoods that were sort of being planned, these plotted colonies, were based on a kind of community development model developed in the US. And it was based on famously known as the neighborhood unit by Clarence Perry in 1929. And it was all the rage. There have been experiments in India even before Delhi took it on. So they were sort of company towns that were designed on the same principles by Otto Königsberger and Albert Mayer and others. But in Delhi, this was especially had a big impact because a lot of the new planning was kind of rolled out through these bare-boned infrastructure led neighborhood designs. This sort of bypassed the issue of having to build houses by the government, and they could just sort of do sites and services. They could do infrastructure, roads and things like that, and then have people build their own homes. Also, the idea behind the neighborhood unit was to have a kind of vigorous, healthy, and rich social life and civic efficiency, a non-sectarian order to kind of battle the religious and political strife which was rampant in the city at the time, right after independence. And so over the years, these were rolled out with the help of cooperative housing societies and group housing societies, as they're called, which were membership-based organizations you could apply to become a part of, and then eventually be given a plot of land under your own name. And by the 1970s, there were about 82 of such cooperative housing societies. Now, one such society was called the Delhi University Teachers Housing Cooperative, or Vaishali Enclave, which was later dubbed. And this is where my house was built by my father. But the timeline that I show in the middle is just to say that this process also took its time. So it isn't that that while the planners who intended to have these sort of planned colonies or the neighborhood unit or the concept behind it wanted to have these spontaneous communities with perfect civic efficiency and kind of this non-sectarian living, people were trepidatious. So not everyone kind of bought a land and immediately built on it at the same time. And in the case of Vaishali, for instance, it took from 1958 to 1984 for just the infrastructure to be handed over to the civic authority. And just as long for people to actually have built up all the houses in these colonies. Parallelly, there was a fair bit of push from the government to have family planning programs and to kind of push for the idea of the single family alongside the nuclear unit as the nation builders, as the next nation builders. So the photograph on the right is our own nuclear unit with my parents and my elder brother and me in my mom's lab. This was the Indian dream, was to kind of get yourself a plot, build a house, get a car, and live with your nuclear family. So this is the house that my father ended up building, the old house, as I will reveal. Single story, simple, with a big veranda in front. The sanction process or the building permit process was fairly simple, straightforward. Very little kind of like expert input went into it. The only expert he had hired was a structural engineer for the drawings and sort of finding out how much steel is needed in the beams and stuff. But mainly it was a self-build project. Now, as time went on, in order to kind of augment the family income, my parents decided that the back part of the house could be rented out to another family, and we could make do with the front. As a result, the pantry at the back kind of doubled as a makeshift second kitchen, and the access to the back to the service lane ended up being a secondary access for the house for the renters. And in the case of many of my other participants, this also ended up being more of an investment for them. So they would build up half a story or another story and rent that out as a separate dwelling unit. Typically, a half story, which kind of was got built on the upper floor, was called a barsati, which is literally something to protect you from the rain. But for many families, this became the second step of housing sort of new migrants to the city. But this also meant that it was already transforming people's understanding of their home. Now, the home was also a place on which they could capitalize or they could get some income off of. So it was no longer just a matter of sort of being a shelter for the family. It also meant that they could have some sort of, they could secure their families' sort of housing futures uh, going later on. But yeah, so each step in this process was sort of slightly shifting their understanding of what land and property means to them. But because everyone was doing this, people started building up, people started renting out parts of their homes for, commercial establishments, uh, big entrepreneurial culture in Delhi. And people started encroaching onto the public land in front of them. These colonies were burgeoning by the time the 80s and the 90s came around. There was already a lot of development happening. People started building 2 to 3 stories. The government allowed for more and more enhancements to your own property, and this is the narrative of the congested sort of plotted colony. This, of course, was not helped by each of the master plans. So the master plans are these kind of all important documents which dictate all the building norms for the city. And with each iteration of the master plan in Delhi, the number of dwelling units allowed and the floor space and the maximum ground coverage and the maximum height of the building kept increasing to the point where the 2041 draft allows for up to 6 dwelling units on a property such as ours, which would be more than what exists right now. So going back to my own house, this is what it looked like till 2009. There was no parking requirements. We had one car. It was a single story home. But then, as I said, people around us were already starting to build these builder floors. And so the neighbors that did this caused major structural damage to our home, and the settlement the foundation kind of settled a little bit. It caused damage along the whole sort of structural wall. It also compromised the sewage line on that side, and so we, as in my parents, had to move out of the home. And by the time they moved out, we were kind of considering possibilities of retrofit, of adaptive reuse, of uh, partial structural restoration, of all kinds of models of redevelopment that we could think of, but things that would fit our budget, things that we could do given the savings that my parents had. Um, but there was a problem. The process to apply for building permits by the time we got around to this, which was 2013, was that we had to apply through an online building sanction software, which had already had a hard baked into it the idea of the mandatory stilt floor for parking. And so, because we didn't actually want to build that much, we only wanted to add like half a story above. This was a big problem. We went to court. We essentially said that given that our case, given that the master plan doesn't actually mandate it, and because this is just a sort of temporary instrument, can we be allowed to do this? But the courts sat on it for a bunch of years. And by 2016, we realized that that's not going to happen. Additionally, we crunched a bunch of numbers and we realized that even with home loans and all our savings put together, we just did not have the money that was needed to build anything which was close to the amount of space we needed, because we also had to build a stilt floor now. So, given that the model has sort of already hard baked into it this capital cost of building a stilt floor, the overall cost of building a house or redeveloping your house is now astronomical, also with the rising construction costs. And the only thing that you can leverage in such a situation is your land value. And so, not just my parents, many people across the city realized that that was the case, and builders were right there to take advantage of the situation. So builders, people who came to you and said, hey, I'm going to front you all this money. I'm going to take care of all the construction. I'm going to take care of all the permits. I'm going to handle the authorities. I'm going to deal with all the contractors. And I'm going to get you a 5-story building where you get ownership of 3 of the floors. You just need to give me 1 of them in return. This is an option that a lot of people chose. So we ended up with this. I am not a huge fan of the building, but it gave my parents what they needed, which was the financial security of not having spent their savings, the security to know, in my father's case, that his 2 sons would return and would have secure housing because they have ownership of 2 more floors. And again, this goes back to the hum do hamare do thing, which is that each family has 2 kids, and it magically so happens that now there are 4 dwelling units. Anyway, but also lots of extra parking, which, of course, given that there are now 4 dwelling units on top, is needed to be accommodated in the stilts. So this is the new house. This is a view from the balcony on the left-hand side, and this is the front gate covering the stilted floor. Just as a comparison, the old house had this kind of relationship with the street. The section on the top shows this kind of very close-knit society in which the veranda is overlooking the street and there is constant social interaction. The terrace on top allows for clothes drying. We used to sleep there often. These were activities that were common across most of my participants. But the builder floors changed that. You no longer have that kind of clear relationship to the street, changes the sociality. You no longer have access to a terrace, a kind of expansive terrace that is just yours. You're kind of sharing it with 3 other dwelling units. But it gives you much larger rooms. It gives you a big kitchen. It gives you all the utilities that you can think of and all the modern amenities you can. Now I have some observations I'll make on each of the chapters, drawing from each of the chapters, which are kind of pertinent to this whole issue. And one of them is how homeowners kind of transform into real estate actors themselves and are kind of caught in this nexus of invest, exchange, grow, because of this sort of system that the builder floors have perpetuated. The map on the right shows a plot in a sort of peripheral location of Delhi that was offered by the builder to one of my participants in exchange for the land value that they were purchasing. So now you find yourself in a situation where you not just have two extra dwelling units in your own building that you are now owner of, but you also have one random extra piece of plot somewhere, sometimes an apartment somewhere else. And so you kind of find yourself with this growing portfolio of properties, and you become a de facto real estate agent, from just being, the owner of your own home. So this is a kind of vicious cycle that this perpetuates. The builders, on the other hand, have kind of grown out of other professions that were existing. So all of the builders that I interviewed were in other lines of work. Some were entrepreneurs, some were contractors, some were architects, some were engineers, either with the government or independently. And they all found this to be such a lucrative kind of business that they all kind of transitioned into this kind of work. And essentially, the whole landscape of professional landscape of these services is quite fungible and quite amorphous at this point. People constantly shift across these boundaries of professional labels and do work across the spectrum. There are sort of things that builders do, which are unique to them, which make them kind of stand out from other services in the sector, but their operations typically remain local. They do business development through word of mouth. They have very strong interpersonal relationships and skills. Their own kinship networks and their class and caste and ethnic backgrounds matter a lot when having exchanges with homeowners, when trying to decide what is the territory of a builder. And so a lot of these things are defined by things which are beyond sort of simple market logics. So it's not just a pre-market system. Now, I have some observations about the evolving typology of the home. One of the key things I found across the spectrum is that building and then rebuilding your house is a fairly emotional process. So it's not just about the clean kind of maths or the economics of it. Most of my participants kind of have these nostalgic ideas about the frugal living that they had while growing up, the trees that were in their front yard, in their veranda, the time they spent on the terrace, the children playing in front of their homes in the streets. And so the builder floors kind of signify to them an irreversible change in that direction, which is the loss of many things. But they also tend to always reconcile their feelings of loss with the material enhancement of their lives. So the quality of living is kind of justified through material assets, a sort of expanded floor area, the luxury and comfort of having modern amenities, and stuff like that. So that goes to an extreme. Some people are fully vested in this and quite enjoy the idea of having the luxury of a large house. In some cases, they maintained ownership. They kind of invested in their own plot. They found money from somewhere. They speculated on their own piece of property to make sure that they have full control and ownership, and enjoy the material benefits that come after. But this also makes the house, literally the home, larger on the inside, and makes it more insular. So now that the home is both separated from the ground and larger with more things inside and being more self-sufficient, it also separates people from other classes, which are now sort of showing themselves in these plotted colonies. A lot of the neighborhood parks, which were earlier occupied by the middle class residents of the neighborhood, are now mostly occupied by the service workers and the maids and the chauffeurs and people that work in these buildings rather than people who live in them. Um, an interesting thing that has happened with builder floors is that while the single family home kind of pushed for the nuclear family, the builder floors have become a way for the joint family system to come back. And with a lot of people, because they now have ownership of up to three or four dwelling units within the same building, intergenerationally, they can just sort of distribute it and have this pseudo quasi joint family system, which has now resurfaced, which is, I thought, a very interesting kind of way of typologies to kind of manifest socially. Now, I'll come to the part about the parking crisis. And so the parking crisis in the colonies that I'm speaking of is mainly to do with on-street parking. And this is mainly because people refuse to park in their stilt floors, even though they now have supposedly sufficient room. And this is now come to a point where people are willing to kill each other over parking or barricade their parking space, which is technically not their parking space. Anyway, the point is that there is a major infrastructure crisis which sort of extends beyond parking. And the approach that experts have to sort of deal with this parking is through demand management measures. They would like to curtail the amount of on-street parking. They would like to have fair pricing for the on-street parking to essentially create a system where you disincentivize the very act of parking rather than kind of applying to kind of giving more and more amenities to the sort of people living in these colonies, which I argue is essentially a kind of ontological crisis, in that there are two different ideas of Delhi and these plotted colonies that people have. The people who live in them, for them, the crisis is that now the streets are all filled up. We don't have anywhere to park. We need more parking spaces. That is the crisis. But for the experts, there is a different kind of crisis. Like Anumita Roy Chaudhary said, there is about a third of Delhi that has already been given over to automobiles and the paraphernalia that they have. So the crisis is more of urbanizable land, of usable land, which is now being taken over by cars. They want to create different cities, one which is supply driven and one which is kind of, disincentivizes automobility. Finally, I have some observations about what might happen in the future, or the future of builder floors. The diagram that you see in the center there is two configurations in which plots have started to be amalgamated or joined up in Delhi. So the photograph to the right of that image, to the right of that diagram, shows plots that are amalgamated side to side. This one has now 8 dwelling units on 2 plots, which are now effectively 1 plot. But also, the one on the extreme right, which is in the corner, is one of my participants who has purchased the property behind them across the service lane and is hoping that at some point in the future, they would be able to build a bridge on the first floor across that service lane and connect the two properties above the stilt floor. So there are potential configurations of amalgamation that are possible, and in fact, more incentivized, the more lax and incrementally lax development norms get. But also, people have been reinterpreting what the builder floor or what the parking stilt is. So, despite the fact that most parking stilts don't allow for any formal use, they're supposed to be uninhabited. Uh, this is the photograph on the bottom shows a boutique hotel that decided to have a automobile showroom on the ground floor as a kind of, you know, midway between having parking and still having commercial use. Um, but also there is the possibility of abandonment. As some of my participants said, they're kind of sick of how plotted colonies have gotten, and how dense they are and how congested the city feels. And so a lot of a sort of flight to the sort of peripheral townships and high-end kind of gated communities is also quite high. So yeah, thank you. Oh, you're muted, Howard.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Manas. Great presentation, very informative, very interesting story of turning something that seems so ordinary into a real issue and intellectual pursuit. So really interesting stuff. Let's have a few questions. We have a few minutes for questions, and anyone in the audience, any visitors who want to ask a question? I'm not able to see my whole screen, so I don't see any. Um, I don't see any. Oh, there we go. Gerard, great.
Yeah, Manas, I have a lot of questions, actually. Nothing that'll derail your dissertation, though, so don't worry about that. But yeah, I found your dissertation really fascinating. I remember when you first approached me about being on the committee, I didn't understand what a building floor was. It would have been helpful if you would have just shown me a picture of your home. Then I would have like, but anyways, you came, now I understand what it is and what you tried to do with it. And I think overall you were successful in taking something kind of telling your kind of personal story, and then understanding like the urban dynamics that come from that. Okay, which I think was pretty clever. Okay, so I'll just ask my questions and you pick the ones you want to answer, or we could, talk about it afterwards. But the first one is like, what's the difference? A lot of what questions I had related to kind of finance. So like, the first question is, well, what's the difference between the builder floors versus like U.S. condominiums? Okay, so that's one question, but you don't answer that yet. I've got better questions. That's the easy one. Okay, your methods. Boy, so so at first I was really kind of confused by your methods. Uh, in the presentation, you didn't really spend a lot of time discussing your methods, but in the dissertation, you spent quite a bit of time discussing your methods. And I think that was really helpful because I thought, you could just use like traditional like social science methods and do a case study and come up with themes and so forth. But instead, you chose to use this what you call this post-qualitative and post-humanist method. And so initially, I thought, I thought that was confusing, but you went along and you nicely explained why you chose that method. Okay. And then now that I hear your talk, after having read your dissertation and hear your talk, I can see how like the subject that you were studying actually relates directly to the method that you used because the subject that you're studying has so many different moving pieces to it. And so you needed to use this method that's maybe not as mainstream, right? But so one question is explain your methods. I mean, you did in your dissertation, like you spent, I think, like 10 pages explaining them, but just briefly for the audience, like what is this posthumanist, and why not just use like traditional like social science or architectural methods?
Actually, I had the brief answer is that I had a few slides on that, and Howard sort of rightfully suggested that that might be a little too much also for the audience. In short,
Blame it on me.
sorry.
It's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, right. Let me be very brief about this. So, post-positivist understandings of social science research is that there is one reality and that we are looking at it from different aspects, right? There is one construction of reality, one empirically understood reality, and that we kind of need to look at it from different aspects, look at different characteristics of things, because reality can be broken down and there is one singular reality. On the other hand, there is sort of constructivist ontologies, which kind of say, well, realities are produced and worlds are produced because people have different truths. So my truth or my story will build my own world. And so that is a kind of constructivist idea. Now, what agential realism does, which is what Karen Berard talks about and talk about more in the dissertation about, is that these are kind of both false in their understanding of the mechanics of both reality and knowledge of reality. So both ontology and epistemology are brought into question in post-qualitative inquiry. And they're always taken together. So it's not that you have to fix one and the other, that we can't only fix the method and be like, oh, epistemology is very important. We need to know stuff exactly. The reality might be fine. On the other hand, the constructivists are saying, well, all the knowledge and the kind of the truth that I have builds my world. So ontology is more important. But what this does is to say both work in tandem. Now, there's a lot to be said about what Karen Berard did for that. But the point is that this whole approach kind of breaks down the barriers between what we might call an object of study, an observer, the apparatus that I use to study it with, because we are all shifting all the time. What we consider to be reality is shifting. The apparatus that we use changes the reality that we are trying to study. And our perspectives and our biases are constantly shifting because we have different ideas of what we are looking at. And this is mostly exemplified by my section on my own interrogation of why I'm coming to this or where I'm coming to this from. So my framing of builder floors as this thing that has changed the middle class has physically produced a new line of inquiry, which is unique to me. Perhaps somebody who's not grown up in a certain kind of home has not gone through this process. Their understanding of what is happening here changes what the end result of the research becomes. And so the point of adopting this approach and this methodology is to say that all of these things are moving parts. And what is most important here is what is produced, not a kind of triangulation of something precise. There is never a kind of triangulation of some precise notion. So therefore, I came to a point where I said, well, I'm not trying to define builder floors. What good would that do? What I'm trying to do is, what does this do to other things? What else does it say about the city that we live in? What else does it say about property? What else does it say about the middle class? What else does it say? So that is really the crux of post-qualitative inquiry, which is that it always asks the question, what else is there? Not to define or label what is currently presented to us. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. So I have just two more questions, Howard. Because I'm on the committee.
Yeah, can we hold those to the, would it be okay if we held those to the private meeting?
The private?
Or,
Sure.
or
Yeah,
there are other people who want to ask questions.
that's okay.
Is that all right? Thomas, do you want to?
That's fine.
Hi, Manas. I will ask a question, pretending I'm maybe this goes along with your the answer you just gave to the previous question, but this is more about like the urban theory side of things. So I was wondering, like the whole Lefebvre-Harvey line of argumentation of the urbanization of capital, which is typically how cities are looked at, where surplus capital is absorbed into redevelopment like this. That's the function of urban real estate. So I was wondering whether your study kind of gives you an insight into how that model, either through this idea of what you talked about, this particular situated position of yours, or the social factors, it gives you a kind of insight into how that model works or doesn't work or works in a different way. That's like question one. It's a broad question. The second question is, I was wondering, because initially you said, what is this term called middle class, right? And you're kind of investigating through the builder floor an insight into this, hazy term we call the middle class. So I was wondering whether this idea of property or ownership of property and ownership of some surplus capital can be used to define, the middle class.
Yeah, I think so. One of the strands that I struggled with, I mean, I don't know if I've done it full justice to in the chapter on capital, is sort of seeing how the state deals with capital, how private players deal with capital, and how individuals like homeowners deal with capital. And the thing is, on the surface, it seems as if these are independent processes, right? The state is introduced to, neoliberal capital after liberalization, realizes that there is potential to be had, and then starts kind of capitalizing on its own land assets and does the stuff that people have been doing all along. Company like Delhi Land and Finance, DLF, does this on the side and has been doing it for a long time and has kind of been operating in the interstices of where the government won't touch land, and they are able to somehow make deals and go through with it. Whereas people have kind of incidentally gone into it, like they've found themselves in a situation where it was frugality, making do till a kind of switch was flipped. And it's very different for every family, of course. But there is also weirdly some synchronicity. There is a kind of turning point where I don't know whether that is your second story that you built, or the third story that you built, or suddenly decided to redevelop, or it is the emergence of somebody called a builder who will help you with this, or it is the government's kind of various changes to acts, for instance. So one of the major things that I didn't get to talk about in this presentation is the change from leasehold property to freehold property, which happened in 1992, which is an act that allows, it was an administrative order, which kind of encourages people to pay a small fee and change what was all leasehold land. I didn't get to tell everyone else about this, but most land in the city was initially owned by the President of India, or that's where it belonged, and everyone had a sublease because India was a mostly socialist state. And so this transition of suddenly having freehold on your own property, something like the ability to sell and exchange general power of attorney, which was again another kind of weird move by which people could kind of sell their property without having to register it in the name of the next person you've sold it. And so these random things that kind of come together in the 90s to kind of spontaneously produce capital. And I'm hard pressed to think of so there have been anthropological studies of like, how global trade and finance and all of that has influenced property development, like townships in the peripheries of Delhi and, big scale stuff. But I'm hard pressed to find studies that kind of talk about this weird mixture of things that kind of suddenly produced money for a bunch of people who didn't know what to do with it initially. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. Nipesh?
Hi, Manas. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting, the work. I have a rather methodological question. So how did it go? Because a lot of your archive, at least the ones which were there in the presentation, you went through your own sort of photographs and stuff which are very closely related to you. So how did it go personally to collect the data where you could pragmatically you could just sway away, in the sense if you're looking through old albums for a photography of your house when it was built, of course if there is a photograph of you eating an ice cream, the story is built up and a lot of time is wasted in these albums. How did you pragmatically deal with that? A. B, to what level emotion was part of the way you put the data together and then thereafter you analyzed it?
So that's the thing. I think so. I have a section in my methodology about the field and myself. And the thing is, there isn't some research that I have to relate myself to or not, right? To distance myself from it or not was never a choice. And I argue it is never a choice for anyone who's ever doing research. Only thing is I leaned into it. And so it's not like for any of my participants, this is not a very emotional, very kind of like close to their chest kind of topic. So it will always be like that. Like it will always invoke all these kind of affective kind of things. It will always invoke connections and associations which may not seem important at the time. And we are always choosing. I'm always choosing to talk about this rather than something else. It's not like there are 50 other things that the builder floors kind of make legible. I chose to talk about the ones that I chose to talk about. And that's the good part about post-qualitative inquiry, I would say. Very kind of open-ended in that sense that we're always in the middle. There is no conclusion. There is not a point where you there's no closure of possibilities of inquiry.
I would like to thank you. One more question, and then we're going to convene the committee along with Manas. So if there's one more question, we can take it. Can't see.
Callum?
Yeah, I'll take it. First off, great presentation, Manas. I especially enjoyed your your response to the last question as an earth scientist from the quote unquote hard sciences. We rarely, discuss the implications of our emotional connection to our topic, and I think that that's a real loss and something where the like earth sciences could really benefit from discussing that. With that kind of context in mind, I'm curious about the implications of builder floors and this kind of urban development on climate resiliency, because Delhi is frequently in the news for heat waves and really intense weather events as a result of climate change, and when things like the trees are being sort of sacrificed to build these builder floors. I'm curious what the impacts of this kind of development are on climate resiliency going forward.
So I'm going to sort of deflect that to say there is a very strong environmental argument that led to the builder floors. So the introduction of the mandatory parking stilt was a fallout of an ongoing long sort of environmental public interest litigation that's been going on in India. And it's been very hard to actually trace the bureaucratic decision-making process that led to that point. But ostensibly, the idea was if we can keep the cars inside people's properties, then maybe we can have the environment of the neighborhood, keep the streets free of parking. So it was in some senses an action on automobility, an action on automobile dependency. Of course, it goes in the opposite direction. it gives people the false sense of hope because it tells people, oh, you can continue to park, you have even more parking now. So it actually does exactly what I said in the second last slide, which is that produces this ontological crisis of should we continue to give more and more parking, or should we kind of find ways to curtail it and kind of disincentivize it? So builder floors are definitely creating more problems. Though in the short term, a lot of people, including some of my participants, feel that it is a good solution.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the visitors. I'm sure that Manas will be happy to answer questions individually as time goes on, but I think we need to move on now to the private meeting between Manas and the committee. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Manas, for a great presentation.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks so much.
Great.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop recording now.